Welcome to this short talk about late Ottoman religious reform and secular nationalism in the period 1908 to 1923. And let's just share the screen here. So we're looking at this period, 1908, from the Young Turk Revolution. Up until that point, from the Tanzimat reforms that were inaugurated in 1839 up to 1908, you had this incredibly intense spread of, within the ruling elites, of positivist, materialist thought, European thinking throughout these elite sectors of Ottoman society. And so in those years, and in the intervening years between 1839 and 1908, the Ottoman ulama, the religious class, had become the subject of heightened contestation. And during the rule of Abdul Hamid, after he suspended the first Ottoman constitution and parliament, in 1876, he had leaned on the religious class and the religious bureaucracy heavily in essentially re-entrenching sultanic absolutism. And that came to be a problem for the reputation of the religious class, and they suffered for it from 1908 and 1909 when Abdul Hamid was finally overthrown. But with the revolution in 1908, with a new order, the re-establishment of the constitution, the religious class found themselves in a difficult position. But it was not only that they themselves had come to be seen as an obstacle to progress in the thinking of the dominant thinking of the Young Turk opposition. It was that this strange happening had taken place of faith itself becoming the focus of attention and coming to be seen as a problem, not just the institutions of the religious bureaucracy. Faith itself had become a problem. This was an unusual development. I'm not sure that it's quite been understood and thought about enough. But certainly the spread of positivist and materialist thinking from Europe, the positivism of August Comte, the German materialism of Ludwig Buchner, both of whose works were heavily translated in this period into Ottoman Turkish, their ideas became very popular, especially amongst the opposition abroad outside Turkey, because during Abdul Hamid's period, there was heavy censorship. It was an early police state in many ways. So from their opposition locations, mainly in Paris and Geneva, they developed these ideas, and a lot of works were published and translated. And so when 1908 came along, the religious scholars essentially found themselves on the back foot. Not just them, but also their supporters amongst the intellectuals. We could call them the devout intellectuals. Those, along with the religious scholars, found themselves on the back foot, and they and their knowledge came to be seen as a bar to progress. So in this period, from 1908, certain publications were the center of debate at this time. Three of them here on the screen. The first of them, Sirat al-Mustaqim, from 1908. It changed its name in 1912 to Sabil al-Rashad. It was the main publication of the reformist religious movement, the religious reformers, modernists, Muslim modernists, who felt that there was a necessity for them to present a new discourse of Islam in their view that was compatible with the modern world, as if that was problematic, but that was the implication behind the reformist discourse. And this was its main publication. And this figure here, Mehmet Akif, who was a poet and a writer, He was the leading intellectual of this movement, and he was the leading figure and writer on this publication. Then the one in the middle, Bayan al-Haq, this was the leading publication of the ulama themselves, the religious class, and specifically the conservatives amongst them. Many of them were very modernist in their thinking, and were on the same page as Mehmet Akif, and you would find them more writing in Sabil al-Rashad than you would in Bayan al-Haq. But Bayan al-Haq was the publication of the conservatives, religious conservatives, conservative in the sense that they did not feel there was a need for a reformation of religious discourse in the way that was being imagined by the modernists, who themselves were responding to the movement that I'm calling, in a very broad sense, secular nationalist. Now, their chief editor was a figure called Mustafa Sabri, a very important figure. He was he was the Grand Mufti, the Sheikh al-Islam, as they called him, the head of the Ottoman religious bureaucracy on 5 separate occasions in the last couple of years of the Ottoman Empire before 1923, when it became a republic. He was a leading figure of the conservatives. And then finally, I mean, there are other publications in covering all of these trends, but the main one amongst the nationalists was this publication, Turki Urdu. And their main ideologue was this figure called Ziya Gökalp, who became the kind of leading, not the only one, but he's come to be seen as having been the most influential of the secular nationalists in this period. So we look first at the nationalist movement, secular nationalist movement. They both go together, those two ideas. They were extremely ferocious in their criticisms of the religious lobby, let's say. And for example, one figure on the right here, Tevfik Fikret, he was a poet in the main, like Mehmet Akif on the left, who was mainly a poet. And he had written a poem in 1905, so in the period of censorship, in the period where things were not even public. He had not published his poem at the time, but he wrote it in 1905, this poem called Tarikh-i Kadim, in which he had described the Quran itself as the death of thought, Maqtal-i Fikr. He referred to it too as an outdated book, Kitab-ı-Kuhne, as you can see on the screen there. And this was published in 1912 because it became possible after the Young Turk Revolution. It became possible to publish this kind of thing. And he entered, that got him into a quite ferocious dispute as well with Mehmet Akif, who responded to him. But he wasn't the only person saying this kind of thing. You also had a leading intellectual of the period. He had been with the Committee of Union and Progress, the party that essentially dominated and came to completely dominate government after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. He was a leading intellectual amongst them. At one point, he had his disputes with them and left, but still he was within that movement. And he had produced an Ottoman Turkish translation of a work by a Dutch Orientalist writer, a scholar, a European scholar, writing about Islam and the Islamic world, called Reinhard Dozy, who had published his work in French, Essai sur l'histoire de l'islamisme, an essay on the history of Islam. And he had published this in translation, and it became the first major Ottoman publication that was openly critical of Islam itself. And it had this language that became very popular in Orientalist European circles at this time, implying that there had been some kind of mental disorder with the Prophet, this kind of language. And Abdullah Cevdet, the figure in question, had translated this, which again triggered an angry response from Mehmet Akif, who was often the leading person to respond to this kind of language that was coming from the secular nationalist movement. So things were pretty ferocious. As well, you had the ideas of, this is Ziya Gökalp. He too had he had a lot of writings, and they were quite comprehensive, and there were a lot of ideas there, and they were not insulting to religion and Islam. Nothing like the others, but they were certainly serious criticisms, because he was trying to say that religion, in a typical Enlightenment sense, had its very specific place where it should be, where it could operate within society, which was not the one of the Islamic order of Ottoman Turkey or essentially of any other Islamic society. It was something for the private sphere. Its institutions should not have any effective role in public life beyond dealing with mosque sermons and preaching. He didn't want religious courts. He didn't want their role in education. And he had an idea too of the Ottoman ruling class itself as having been non-national, that their attitude, the ruling class, was in essence colonial. It was foreign. So it was kind of pathologically non-national. And he even thought the language itself, in its hybrid nature, Ottoman Turkish was, in its upper registers, was a very hybrid language because of the Persian grammatical structures there, the vocabulary from Persian, and especially from Arabic. So he felt that they were non-national, even in the way that they wrote and they thought, which he contrasted with the people. He kind of glorified the Anatolian populace, separate from the elites in Istanbul, as having been the kind of true essence of Turkishness in his thinking. And while it didn't mean debunking the place of religion completely in people's hearts, it did mean removing it from public space. So this was the kind of thinking that he had. So these were very serious ideas and a serious challenge to the religious institutions and the devout intellectuals and the ulama. And they had their responses. Now here you can see as well as Iago Kalp the kind of language he's using. He's using the words theocracy from French. He's saying clericalism. He's using the French term, and he's introducing them into the language. And this is from his major work from 1923, just before he died, where he's talking about the need to remove religion from public space. And you can see the kind of language he's using. He's sounding like a post-Enlightenment European intellectual. So with the religious lobby, there was some pushback to this kind of thinking. They pushed back on the question of nationalism. Their point was that Islam itself had been in its early period a rejection of partisan tribalism. So why would the Ottoman state turn towards some form of ethnic pride, ethnic nationalism, as was being promoted by Gökalp and the others? Why would they want to do that? Mehmet Akif as well, he was of Kosovan Albanian origin, and he too responded angrily to this kind of thinking that was coming from the secular nationalist ideological grouping. Now, the other thing that began to happen in this period, the debate began to get quite fierce, and the religious lobby started to question the religiosity of the other side. And these words came into public usage. This term, dinsiz, meaning without religion, literally, was used by the devout intellectuals and their supporters to describe Gökalp and the others. And that provoked a response from Gökalp himself, who began to use this term Islamcı, Islamist, to describe his opponents, because one reason was because he felt that their approach was, because of their rejection of nationalist thinking, that they were being, in his view, they were being pan-Islamic, meaning they thought that the Ottoman state, had some kind of responsibility and authority outside the borders of the state. And that's what he completely rejected. He rejected this kind of pan-Islamic thinking. But also by using Islamja, he was responding to this idea of dinsiz, because he didn't want to acknowledge the logic of dinsiz, which is that the secular nationalists are somehow atheistic. Now, of course, some of them were, that's absolutely clear, but not all of them. And not Gökalp, he certainly didn't think of himself in those terms. So Islamja was a way of getting around that language. It was saying, you're Islamist, we're all Muslims, but you're being Islamist. Now, of course, this language becomes widespread in the late 20th century, especially in Arabic, and then into English. And it's often thought that it comes from, that's where it emerges in Arabic, it emerges in association with the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt, and movement in Egypt, and becomes even more, it moves into English heavily after the Iranian Revolution. But it's quite striking. The term and the idea actually come from pre-Turkish Republic, in this very intense period of contestation at the end of the Ottoman Empire. Further, in these responses from the religious lobby, you had the wartime prime minister, Said Halim Pasha. He was on the devout intellectual side, even though he was the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress. He was their prime minister figure during the war, but he was kind of a puppet in a sense. He didn't have much power. He had a book that came out called Islam Lashmak, which literally means to become Islamic or to Islamize. And the idea there is quite striking, because the implication is that society has lost something of its status as being Islamic or being Muslim, and that somehow your faith has come into question by the change in the nature of the structure of society as well, politically. The pushing back against the role of the religious bureaucracy in education and over law itself had something to say about the nature of your faith. So again, you have ideas that become very popular within the Islamist movement later in the 20th century, again, being rolled out for the first time in this period. Now, his work, Islam Lashmak, it was actually translated, it was written in French and it was translated into Turkish by Mehmet Akif, who also put it into many of his works, put his works into Arabic. So you had quite a pushback from the religious lobby, but they did give ground quite significantly on other points. They concede ground. Now they concede ground on firstly Sufism. This was something that was heavily attacked by the secular nationalists, and of course by the Western European Orientalists. They focused on Sufism as being a culture of laziness, indulgence. It was intellectually indulgent and anti-modern in that it was, as you could say, multivocal with its complex of saint figures. And these ideas really began to sink in with people like Mehmet Akif and a host of others, that somehow there was a problem with Sufism, that it was somehow it was somehow irrational to a degree, but it was anti-modern because of these elements, that it encouraged people to waste their intellectual efforts, it encouraged laziness, and that it was multivocal, which was problematic in itself. European ideas that were feeding into the idea of Muslim modernists. Also connected to that was the idea of fatalism. This was a theme that was very strong in the writing of European Orientalists in the 19th century, or historians, diplomats, other people who wrote about Islam in this very pejorative manner. And one of the things probably their central accusation in many ways, in theological terms, was it was a fatalistic religion. And these ideas were despite rejection, despite the claim that that this wasn't true about Islamic theology, in essence it was accepted. But the responses are so many that, in a sense, ground was given to this idea. And Mehmet Akif was inspired by Muhammad Abduh, the Egyptian religious scholar, in whose writings as well there was a conceding of ground on this point about fatalism and on Sufism. And Akif translated many of Muhammad Abduh's works, And in Akka's poetry, which is, he has a huge volume of work. Most of it's collected together in this one tome called Safahat. There are 7 of them that went over around 20 years. And in them, he has many themes along those lines about Sufism and fatalism being problematic. And he has this idea, for example, that he talks about the West that is active. He talks about the East that is stagnant. And these ideas of stagnant and active, they were there from the 1820s with the French historian Guizot, who talked about the stagnant state or the état stationnaire of Islamic culture. And in Arabic, you find Muhammad Abdu talking about jumud, this kind of frozen, stagnant state of Islamic culture. And then you find Mehmed Akif using the same kind of language, though he more develops a theme of sa'i fi amal. This idea of action activity is what has to happen, because, as he says, as you can see there, atil olan shark, it's stagnant, it's not moving. So these ideas became quite widespread in the discourse of the Muslim modernists, and also they start to talk as if they're embarrassed about miracles, because this is not empirical knowledge. So they're taking this as well from the ideas of Muhammad Abdu. So, but one of the major ideas that then develops in this context is this search for the new Martin Luther. The idea being that, as the Europeans have been saying, Islam needs a reformation. So, of course, the Europeans are thinking of everything along the lines of their own experience with Christianity and how it's emerged through the Enlightenment. And they're imagining that all other civilizations and societies and religions have to somehow go through the same processes. So everything is being fit within the same kind of framework. So this idea there has to be a Martin Luther. Now, the idea of a Protestant revolution, it even comes up in the writings of Jamaluddin Afghani in his work that was translated by Muhammad Abdu and someone else into Arabic, called The Refutation of the Materialists, Rad ala Dahriyin. There he mentions the idea that Islam needs a kind of revolution that Guizot has mentioned. This is how he phrases it. As well, Abdullah Jevdet, who we mentioned before, he talks in 1909 in that translation he did of Dozi's essay on Islam. There's a addendum at the end where he talks about the need for a Martin Luther. The idea comes that this figure here, Musa Jalal Begiev, who was from near Crimea, writing in something similar to Ottoman Turkish, became quite popular within certain circles in Istanbul. And then some others within this modernist circles began to laud himself through his writings as being Islam's Luther. And this figure of Hashim Nahid, he describes him as Islam's Luther. He likes what he's been saying about how there's no need to engage in the Ramadan fast. He did one of the first translations into Turkish of the Quran, which became a big controversy in the 1920s and 30s. But the first was actually done by him. He has the idea that the idea of punishment for how we're living our lives and hellfire is something that shouldn't be taken literally. He's kind of developing the idea of Christian mercy within an Islamic context is essentially what's going on with him. But Nahid claims that he's Islam's Luther. And one of their major ideas is this idea that not only Sufism has been a kind of gigantic waste of time over centuries, but that everything within Islamic sciences, within Islamic knowledge, has been a waste of time in the intervening years between the Abbasid era, the end of the Abbasids, and the 19th century. This idea is that their thinking is that Europeans progressed, we fell behind. We fell behind because we were producing nothing. Of course, this is a big theme throughout a whole load of literature in the 19th and 20th century. But it's argued very strongly by Muslim modernists in this period. So they're arguing that philosophy was useless, that speculative theology, kalam, was useless. There was nothing happening in the sphere of logic. And they start talking about how there needs to be a kind of social Sharia, whatever that means, rather than Sharia itself. And they're pushing the idea of human agency because they think that they've taken on board this idea that Islamic theology was fatalistic. So this is another theme that they're pushing as well. So this idea of the search for the Luther, it becomes a big theme after 1908 and even into the early Republic as well, until finally someone actually declares within the Republican context that he's been found. And it's this guy. Yep, it had to be Mustafa Kemal himself. And in fact, the claim came from none other than the American ambassador, Charles Sherrill, in a work he wrote after he'd been an ambassador there around 1932, and just after he published a book, kind of memoir of his period. He praises Mustafa Kemal for the various reforms and announces that he, in fact, is the Islamic Luther. He's finally been truly found. So, of course, when with the success of Mustafa Kemal's forces in Anatolia after the end of the First World War, the Ottoman state has lost. You have two rival authorities between Istanbul that developed between Istanbul and Ankara after Mustafa Kemal builds up a force to challenge the Greek invasion from 1919 and establishes a parliament in Ankara. So you have these two rival authorities. And in 1922, after defeating the Greek invaders, the Ankara forces of Mustafa Kemal, they move into Istanbul. And really the religious lobby realize that the game is up at this stage. And many of them flee, including Mustafa Sabri, who had been the Grand Mufti in those intervening years, and his deputy Zahid Kawthari, or Al-Kawthari, as he became very well known in Arabic. Both of them flee and settle in Egypt in the end. Amongst the others, like Mehmed Akif, they hung around for a while, but finally the pressures were too much for them. They were denounced in the nationalist media. Mehmed Akif was denounced at ceremonies in public and attacked for not being ethnically Turkish was one attack that was used against him. Even though he was the author of the national anthem that had been accepted around 1921, and in there he had used language that tried to appeal to secular nationalist thinking as well as to Islamic thinking. It's an interesting text because it brings them both together, but it seems he didn't really please either side. And they didn't please the new order. So they lost. And what succeeded in their place was indeed extremely radical. As is well known, the Sharia courts were completely removed. Islam as a state religion was removed from the constitution. Sartorial regulations and laws were passed, such as that you had to wear a European hat if you were a government bureaucrat, a male working in the bureaucracy. European hats were seen as a sign of progress. The fez, which in itself was actually only decades or 100 years or so old, was suddenly seen as a kind of a symbol of, well, at least the Ottoman era, if not some other kind of backwardness in the new thinking. And so that itself was banned. One of the most important reforms that they did, radical reforms they did, was to change the language in many ways. But it began with a change specifically of the script, because Arabic script, as Ottoman Turkish was written in, was seen as being in itself backward. But not only that, it was a clear link to a whole world of thought and culture and history which the new regime did not want. And so if you change the script, people cannot access so much more material anymore. And that's your chance to really reframe a nation and its knowledge and its thinking, which is what they did. And this went to the extent of this radical project to remove Arabic in the call to prayer, which was done for some 20 years or so. Early 1930s. I mean, it was done away with in the end after this radical early period was over, and some of it was rolled back. But the secular nationalist movement was extremely successful, and the change was very sudden. And so, just a few final thoughts on this. What's really striking is how these changes that happened really happened through the capture of an elite, because at the time, these reforms were not popular throughout the mass of the population. And even in the years when those years after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they're lost during the First World War, and the establishment of the Republic, after when Mustafa Kemal established his army, re-established the army and fought the Greek invaders, and then moved into Istanbul and Britain, which was the main occupying power, acceded to the whole process and didn't fight back in any way. It was an ideology they were bringing that was minoritarian. It belonged to the elite, and people who were fighting in those armies, Anatolians, didn't think of themselves as fighting for these kind of radical reforms. They thought of themselves as fighting for their sultan or even their caliph, and were surprised when those institutions were removed in 1922 and then 1924. So it shows how much the importance of the people in important positions of power can do a lot. If you take hold of certain institutions, there's a lot you can do, and that's what happened in this case. It obviously has its resonances even today, because this conflict over the shape of the state and the role of religion is one that, despite its exaggeration in media, or its to the exclusion of other important elements about modern Turkey, it really was the underlying dispute of the era, and it explains, of course, much about the final success of the Islamist movement with the AKP in 2002, although it had kind of broken away from the main Islamist movement, but still that's where it came from. And to this day, as we see, appealing to the arguments over this era, over Abdul Hamid on the far left, and the Young Turk movement, and the early Kemalist movement, those arguments are very much alive. And, you know, there's been a lot of rethinking of Abdul Hamid, and he's become very popular with the ruling party over the last 20 years. As you can see, this guy on the right tries to sometimes model himself like him. And you've had a soap opera in recent years that was extremely popular about Abdul Hamid. And this, in fact, on the right here is a poster for it, which is in Urdu, because it was popular around the world in many countries, Muslim countries, including Pakistan. So this period of really intense period between 1908 and 1923 was a time of serious conflict and argument. It set the tone for Islamist politics throughout the 20th century, but not in Turkey, to the extent that I think many people have even, I think much of scholarship has even forgotten that there was such a movement, that the ideas of Islamist movement of the late 20th century, that they had been thrashed out, tried out, experimented with in this period. So it has a lot to tell us. And thank you very much for your attention. and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.